He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. Well, mistakes happen, everyone makes them, but that's exactly why security protocols exist when you're doing important stuff that's supposed to be super secret. But security systems are only as effective as the people who use them, and looping in a senior journalist into a top-level chat about imminent military strikes, well, that's next-level stupid.
Has there been a up like this one about something that is totally confidential?
Probably not. And here's the irony for the media.
The one person who is cautious with the information that he puts out is the actual investigative journalist.
But as we'll hear this week, that didn't stop the MAGA men from playing a lame blame game with their media. Also on Mediawatch this week, we catch up on the bitter battle to control NZME, the company that publishes The Herald and owns News Talk ZB. And it's a battle being fought out these days by exchanges of letters. And we look at how producers behind the scenes can keep their presenters on the mic on the straight and narrow. But first, it's not news that our economy's been going backwards and that the numbers on that don't lie. But now some new numbers show it's on the way up, and that is news. But other economic numbers in the news are still bad news. This week we look at the dire data and the claims of economic green shoots, and we ask if the media might be mixing its messages and confusing us all.
Without wanting to be all doom and gloom, but, this one little woohoo that came out at 10:45 on Wednesday that is already nearly 4 months old, 3 months old, it's just, as you say, it's just too sort of blunt a figure.
Yeah. Catherine Ryan there on RNZ National last Tuesday with a thorny question for one of her regular guests on 9 to noon, the business journalist Dan Brunskill from interest.co.nz. Fresh GDP figures out last week showed that some parts of the economy seem to be improving, but consumer confidence is not. Why not? Dan Brunskill said the answer lies in how New Zealanders feel about their own economic security.
What do we make of consumer confidence? Is it simply how people feel and how they're likely to behave because of that?
Yeah, it's very closely linked to employment prospects. Most people in New Zealand, whether they're doing well or not, just depends on how good their job is, how likely they are to get a better one, how likely they are to get a pay rise, how likely they are to lose their job. And on all those metrics, the one people care about most, the labour market's still really weak. If you lose your job, you may not get another one. If you ask for a pay rise, your boss will say no, and you're unlikely to get a better job next week.
In other words, it's my economy stupid, according to Dan Brunskill. And as if to make that point, this breaking news was on the 11am bulletin on RNZ National just minutes earlier.
And finally in this bulletin, the labour market remains in its worst shape in more than 4 years. Jobs are harder to find, wage growth is slowing, and workers are more concerned about holding on to their positions. The Westpac McDermott Miller Employment Survey shows overall confidence fell 3.3 points to 88.3 in the 3 months ended March, a level last seen in 2020 when the pandemic was unfolding.
Not good. But how did we go from the woohoo that Catherine Ryan mentioned last week to what Dan Brunskill called COVID-era bad stats in confidence and employment? Well, that vibe was definitely different 7 days before in the media.
The economy is slowly showing signs of life. Gross domestic product figures from the last 3 months of 2024 showing the country emerging out of recession and starting to grow just at 0.7%. The GDP numbers out on the day, our biggest company, Fonterra, posted a whopping profit. Dairy among the bright sparks in a still gloomy economy.
TVNZ's Simon Dallow on One News last week, the day that the new stats revealed a bit more growth in GDP than most experts had dared to hope for. And after that, TVNZ's economics reporter Katie Bradford found some signs of life and growth in an Auckland cake shop.
The popularity of these cinnamon rolls is rising almost as fast as the dough. These lines start building first thing.
Now, obviously, we're having 2 extra staff members in the future. Well, not even in the future. Next week, we'll be having another staff coming in.
A good sign as unemployment continues to rise.
That is indeed a bit of good news. New hires, rising dough, sparks in the gloom, all part of the package there on One News. But the growth is mainly from dairy and tourism, and even with all the housing and infrastructure that we need, construction is down. So Katie Bradford asked the Minister of Finance and Economic Development, Nicola Willis, isn't that a bit of a problem?
Are you worried that we're back to being too reliant on a couple of sectors to keep the economy going?
I have confidence that the New Zealand economy has many green shoots across a number of sectors.
And while that boutique bakery that Katie Bradford visited seemed to be one of those, she summed up like this on One News.
Well, I think the only person super excited about these figures today is Nicola Willis, of course, and it is good to see that sign of growth. It is good to see that positive figure. It's higher than most people expected as well, but that number has been just bouncing along close to zero, either just above it or just below it for a couple of years now. So nothing exciting there.
But also not as super excited as Nicola Willis was Esther Robinson on the podcast 3 Gals, 1 Beehive.
If I have to hear the phrase, oh, we're getting some green shoots again, in media or in an op-ed, I'm going to actually cry.
3 Gals, 1 Beehive is a podcast pitched as 3 Kiwi women on a mission to make politics interesting and even fun once a week, but also sufficiently sweary that we had to deploy the Mediawatch censorship klaxon for former staff journalist turned PR professional Georgina Stilianou when she was talking about those new GDP figures.
0.7%, and most of it propped up by tourism in the peak summer season.
Indeed.
Well, if we're calling, I find I'm just a little bit cynical about all this. Like, why don't we just downplay it? Be cautious.
The Grinch is here.
I am.
Take some good news. Like, this
I can't
is good.
Some green shoots.
Seriously,
yeah, there's
I'm
green
not gonna...
shoots.
Okay.
Green shoots and trees.
The other of the 3 gals you heard there is Brigitte Morton, a familiar political pundit in our media. Formerly, she was an advisor for a national-led government and a National Party member who volunteers for Nicola Greenshoots Willis. She wasn't on quite the same page on those green shoots, though she was using some of the same language.
You've got an attitude problem, young lady. 11 of the 16 industries that they measure grew this quarter. So when you're like, oh, it's just the people coming in the summer, it's not. And also, GDP per capita per person rose. So this is always, I think, more important sometimes than even that headline figure, because this is actually dependent on the number of people, because you can have GDP rise just because you've got more people here. Yeah. So that's really important to measure. So that's at rose 0.4. So this is the first time it's gone up in 2 years. So me, this is great, Georgie, and I refuse to be walked down into the doldrums by you.
I see your green shoot and I stick it up my ass.
But one thing that the 3 gals did all agree on, more or less, is that the surprise uptick in GDP doesn't actually mean much to ordinary Kiwis, at least not yet. On News Talk ZB, Mike Hosking told his listeners that the better-than-expected result will tell you that the current government might have got a grip on the worst of it and turned the tide. But when the latest Ipsos Issues Monitor came out that same week, it was not a message that had taken hold. Ipsos tracks the issues most important to New Zealanders today by surveying 1,000 of them each month, and in February it found the lowest level of support for and approval of any government since 2018. Also, at that same time, the latest Westpac McDermott Miller Consumer Confidence Survey dropped, showing a lack of confidence out there. And 3 gals Esther Robinson summed that up this way.
Consumer confidence is 89.2%, and anything below 100 is considered negative. Last quarter, it was 97.5, so it's dropped. And this quote really stuck out to me. BNZ economist Stephen Topless, he said, if we exclude the misery of the last few years and 1 quarter during the GFC, you must go all the way back to the deep recession of 1991 to get a reading this low.
And she wasn't the only one highlighting the verdict of the BNZ's head of research, simply awful. Among them was Newsroom's Rebecca Howard, who said the dire data that day also added to the view that growth will likely remain sluggish even if New Zealand did come out of recession in late 2024. And added to that, some politicians were talking up the depth of the economic mire this week, even those in the government.
As we see the economy turn, when does that sink in with the voter, do you reckon?
No, my point yesterday was to tell the mainstream media you stood there, you were the victim, and we all were of a tissue of lies, and you didn't do your darn job, and that's the reason why we had our State of the Nation.
ZB's Mike Hosking talking to the New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters one day after his State of the Nation speech last weekend made an awful lot of the bad state of our economy. But when Mike Hosking asked the same question of Winston Peters again, he was again told we are in desperate need of an economic turnaround.
Yeah, but that's why I'm asking, when do you reckon that sinks in with the voter and they get it and see it?
Oh, well, look, so many people are university coffee bar experts when it comes to political science and those sort of studies, but we're not concerned about that in New Zealand First. We're concerned to go out there and say that this country has got tremendous chance to turn itself around and be what we used to be, a leading country.
Now, the soon-to-be Deputy Prime Minister saying we're not a leading country anymore is not exactly going to pump up any future surveys of consumer confidence. And Mike Hosking could have mentioned that for most of the past 7 years of economic backsliding, Winston Peters himself has been the Deputy Prime Minister with other people from his party around the cabinet table. But somehow that didn't come up. So we have pessimistic public perceptions then, and politicians being either positive or negative in public for political purposes, so other media helping us with the big picture on the economy. Well, in the Herald on Sunday last weekend, business editor-at-large Liam Dan said that the gap between the data and how we feel about the economy is growing. And under the headline, "If this is a recovery, why does it feel so bad?" he wrote this.
As an economic commentator, I try to be upbeat. I can see plenty of green shoots on the economic outlook.
Well, that sounds good, but he also said those Westpac and Ipsos surveys suggest that the discontent is very real.
It suggests people don't think things are getting better. They're still mired in the kind of gloom that would have made more sense in the middle of last year when we were in a recession that rivaled 1991. If people don't think things are going to get better, then they might not.
Now, Liam Dan reckoned that the strong GDP result last week is being underpinned by agricultural earnings and the return of tourists, but that was a good thing and not a worrying weakness. And likewise, when he was talking to ZB's Kerry Woodham about that on the air the next day.
I think we just need a round of applause for our dairy farmers too. Right throughout, all through COVID, all through recessions, all through... What on earth would New Zealand Inc. have done without them?
Yeah, and I mean, really looking like they're going to go a long way to saving us. You know, Fonterra with a good result this morning.
But record farm gate prices for farmers and Fonterra means record shop shelf prices for milk, butter and cheese and everything that has that in them for the rest of us. And in the Herald on Sunday, Liam Dan also said that explains why people in the city still feel like we are still in recession. And on ZB, he told Kerry Woodham this.
And where it's been weak is things like construction, which, you know, really affects a place like Auckland. So maybe, you know, it's a case that you'd be forgiven for being more surprised if you were in the cities.
Well, imagine being in Wellington.
Yeah, well, that's right.
But just last Wednesday, those latest GDP figures broken down by region came out. And guess what? Wellington is top with more than $92,000 per head, and Auckland's next up on about $88,500, and that's substantially greater than the $78,233 that is the national average. Those stats only run up to the end of March 2024, and things could have taken a downward turn in the past 12 months, but it does fit the pattern of the past 5 years. And after that gloomy Westpac employment confidence survey that came out last Tuesday, interest.co.nz quoted Westpac's chief economist Michael Gordon as saying this.
The survey results for the March quarter differed substantially across the country, with only 4 out of 11 regions recording a fall in confidence. But one of those was Auckland, which dominated the national average.
So could it be a coincidence then that those two places, Wellington and Auckland, are also the hubs of our national media? That's a question I put to Dan Brunskill, interest.co.nz's political and economics reporter based in the Parliamentary Press Gallery. That phrase, green shoots, we've seen it used by government, some journalists, some commentators. It also annoys some people, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's not a terrible way to talk about signs in the economy, early signs that the economy might be getting better. I think what I have a bigger problem with is when people sort of promise that the green shoots will turn into a beautiful field of crops. Green shoots, you know, can be early indicators can be misleading, and green shoots can die out. So we shouldn't get green shoots confused with sort of an economic turnaround or leaving recession. It's a useful way to say there are promising signs, but it doesn't promise anything will come of it.
Yeah, I actually pitched up in England in the mid-1990s, and then the Prime Minister was John Major of the Conservative Party, and they'd had a long recession, and the economy had just, when I got there, had just ticked over into a tiny positive growth. And a lot of the political comment was about green shoots. And the response to it was so negative.
Really?
Really hostile. The Chancellor was being pulled to pieces. And I asked people at the time, surely this is good news if you've had economic trouble, that the economy is now turning. And they were saying, look, mate, you haven't been here. You don't know what it's like. People think it's a boosteristic thing to say. They think they're being spun, maybe.
Yeah, because it cannot be true. I mean, I remember sort of in the run-up to the election, one of Labour's lines was, the economy's turning around, inflation's coming under control, we're having a turnaround now, things are going to get better now. And that wasn't true. We had another year or so of difficult times ahead. So I guess what I'm saying is don't look at one GDP number, call it green shoots and say that means the bad times are over. The bad times may not yet be over.
Okay, well, we've had those GDP stats last week, but also then, as we heard, surveys of consumer confidence, employment, not reflecting that. The data's not all being gathered at the same time, though, is it? So does that run the risk of confusing the public?
Yeah, it's a bit tricky because particularly our GDP data takes a long time to come out. So, the GDP numbers we're talking about were the end of 2024. We're now all the way through the first quarter of 2025. That December data looked almost a little bit better than the more recent March data. If you look at what's been happening in the first quarter of this year, confidence is really low, employment hasn't picked up, people are nervous about Trump tariffs and what's happening globally. There was this little uptick in GDP in the last quarter of last year as interest rates fell, and after we had two very big falls, remember, so we're coming up from a very low base. And, we had the energy crisis as well, which contributed to the bad GDP numbers. So just the fact that we no longer were in an energy crisis would probably lead GDP to pick up a little bit. So there's just lots going on in that quarter that almost looks more positive than this quarter. So there's always a risk that you're looking at old data and saying, that looks like green shoots, when the newer data looks a little bit less green.
Okay. Well, Liam Dan, the Herald's business editor-at-large, wrote about this, and he said there's a gap between the data and how we feel about the economy, and that gap is growing. If people don't think things are going to get better, then they might not. First of all, is he right? Is there a self-fulfilling prophecy problem that if people don't think it's going to get better, it might not?
On the second point, yes, confidence. How confident you feel as a consumer or as a business dictates how much you invest, which dictates how much the economy grows. So there's a direct relation there. If you feel negative about the future, you probably won't, if you're a person, buy a new washing machine or a new car. If you're a business, you won't hire a new staff member or launch a new product. But in terms of the gap between what economists call the economic reality and what people call their actual lives, I'm more skeptical about that. Economists and business people and commentators like myself, we look at forecasts all day, we think about what's going to happen next, we're constantly thinking and talking about how good or how bad things will be soon.
Yeah.
Whereas normal people, they live in the past. They think about how good or bad their life has been over the past year, and they simplistically but usefully predict that sort of environment will continue. So I think probably journalists could be a little bit better at living in the moment and not living in sort of hypothetical forecasts which may or may not come to pass.
Okay. Well, I mean, to as you mentioned there, Liam's words, if people don't think things are going to get better, then they might not. They're getting their ideas from the media, aren't they? So does the media need to rethink how they present these figures, either whether it's quoting politicians talking about green shoots or taking a headline out of a consumer confidence survey, which also, like the GDP thing, might be based on in the past, even a few months back?
When I write a story about, an economic forecast and what's going to happen next, if you scroll down to our comment section, most of them will be like, oh yeah, I've seen these forecasts before. Like, people are very skeptical about what's published in the media. So I don't flatter myself to think that whatever I write about the economy is what people think about it.
And it's not going to contradict that human nature thing you just said about what's happened to them in the recent past colours their impression of what
you've
will
just
happen
lost
in the
your job
future.
And I write a story saying jobs are going to be easy to come by now, you're going to say, yeah, right. You're not going to be like, oh, great news. So happy to hear that, Dan.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, Liam, Dan and others have also pointed out one thing they divine from the data in its various forms, that the regions and rural sector and their industries seem to be people in the cities, not so much, and confidence data in Wellington and Auckland particularly lower than elsewhere. Maybe I'm stretching here, but our national media are headquartered in Wellington and Auckland. Does that possibly colour the coverage if there is a kind of two-speed thing going on? Big cities gloomy, regions, South Island, okay?
Yeah, definitely. And Wellington is the worst culprit of this, I've got to say. I'm sitting here in Wellington right now.
Yes, we are.
Yeah, it's...
full disclosure.
Full disclosure. Wellington is a very small part of the economy. If you're in Auckland, you also have that urban-rural problem. But at least in Auckland, you're sampling almost a third of the economy. So if you're just walking down, Wellington's High Street and asking people how they're doing, there's no reason to think that will be representative of the country in any way, shape or form. It might be doing much better, it might be doing much worse. So in Wellington in particular, you need to be really careful. In Auckland, it's a little bit better because it is the biggest part of the economy and it is exposed to all sectors. But certainly, the South Island and agricultural regions are performing much better than urban regions right now. And that is just because those sectors are the ones doing much better. And farmer confidence, for example, is at a 10-year high. Profitability is massively improved over the last year. So, farming publications, people in touch with the regions are telling that story, but perhaps journalists that are more focused on services, high street, urban environments, they might be telling that story less. You also get stuck in I don't want to call it hysteria, that's too strong, but like a news hook will form and a narrative will form around it. And a great example is hospitality closing in Wellington. There have been some cafes closed, there have been some restaurants closed. It's not been crazy numbers, and most of them that have closed, a new one has opened up immediately in the same location. So you regularly see stories about, this place is closing, that place is closing, and it feels like we're in some great recession.
And particularly if they're ones that have been around for 20 years or something like that.
Except that the old ones are often the ones that fail in a recession because they haven't adapted and modernised, and maybe they've actually fallen out of fashion and it's not that hard to push them over, and then something new and hopefully better pops up in its place. And I think the media sometimes lose sight of that because you just see a string of stories about things closing and you don't follow up to see has something come in behind it, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And also another interesting factor in this, I think, is we have lots of political parties in Parliament that might want to make their own points about the economy. So, for example, Audrey Young in the New Zealand Herald was pointing this out. You have Winston Peters saying, look, the economy was terrible, we're turning it around now. For example, he's saying things like Labour told us lies about the state of the economy, and Audrey Young is saying actually the pre-foo outlooks, that's not Labour's doing, that's done by Treasury. So is it a bit weird that even ones in government like Winston Peters are saying things about the economy that are very dramatic and could be influential, but doing it for political purposes?
Let me put it this way. If people in the financial markets and the global financial markets believed what Winston Peters said, we would be having a financial crisis right now. He's not being serious, and people are not taking him seriously because you would see a huge reaction in the global markets to the price of our bonds, to willingness. We just had a bunch of investors here in New Zealand looking to join up with the government to do PPEs. None of them would be here if they thought our fiscal accounts were faked. Yeah, imagine you're about to invest in a company and their deputy chief executive comes to you and says, we actually regularly falsify the financial accounts. You'd run a mile.
Okay, fair enough. And look, interestingly, when this GDP data came out that caused the spike of green shoots type news stories and political commentary, you were in India. Where the Prime Minister was making this big push, free trade agreement, upping exports to improve our economy. Now, a lot of the coverage here of that zoomed in on where the dairy would be part of the deal. And apart from there are a lot of photo ops about cricket, including photographs by you appearing in our national media. Nice photos.
Thank you very much. I was flattered by that.
Did our media miss a trick by, just constantly focusing on that one aspect of dairy and a free trade agreement?
I think it's fair to focus on dairy. That's our largest export. And importantly, a big reason the deal failed last time is that we insisted on having dairy in it. And, reports say, and India wouldn't budge on that. So it's pretty fair when the government's going back to say, well, dairy was a roadblock last time, why do you think it isn't this time? Because in that sense, dairy is not just about dairy, but about the whole deal. If dairy is still a deal breaker for the government, then the whole deal won't happen. So by reporting on dairy, you are kind of reporting on the whole deal, the likelihood of the whole deal going through. And it is our biggest export. So I think there's it's as good angle as any other to focus on.
Okay.
I like to think we covered the broader aspects. I think journalists were hoping to get an admission out of the government that they were willing to compromise on dairy, and that would have been a big story. So I think people were pushing hard, hoping that story would break. We didn't quite happen, so maybe it was a wasted effort. But I can see why the focus was there.
What's it like writing about business and economics in this situation where the Trump administration could just upend anything almost any given day? Is it fun and interesting and challenging, or does it just make the job unbelievably frustrating?
Businesses hate uncertainty. Journalists love it. You don't know what's going to happen next. That's much more fun than knowing what's going to happen next. But in terms of what it means for businesses and the economy, it's really hard for them. So if confidence remains low because people don't know what Trump's going to do literally next week, Trump's going to impose some tariffs next week. But yeah, it's fun for me.
Does it feel like you're writing stories? You're almost having to write a paragraph in almost every single one saying, but a caveat here, we don't know what the States is going to do and everything's up in the air.
That's always true, though. Like, we write a lot about forecasts and we think a lot about economic forecasts. But what we never say is that economic forecasts are, and there are always surprises, there are always changes. The forecast that you were looking at will almost never happen exactly. So a forecast is just a scenario saying, if nothing changes from here, this is what things will look like. Forecasts are useful, but they're never truly representing the future. And that's always true, and it's just more true at the moment than usual.
But yeah, there's no matrix that you can factor in what Trump may or may not do because it's completely unpredictable.
You can't forecast what he's going to do, and we can't even really forecast how that will affect the global economy because it is such an orthodox policy.
Good luck. Sounds like a fun job to have.
It's going to be a good, yes. Just keep reading, keep listening. There's lots to come.
That was Dan Brunskill, political and economics reporter for interest.co.nz, based in the Parliamentary Press Gallery, who, as you heard there, also accompanied his colleagues from the gallery to India for the Prime Minister's visit and the Prime Minister's bid for a free trade agreement there. Last Wednesday, Mediawatch's Hayden Donnell joined Emile Donovan here on RNZ National for Midweek Mediawatch, our regular weekly catch-up on nights. Hayden ran through the latest in a now fairly longish running saga of the Canadian billionaire James Grennan and his bid to roll the board of NZME, the New Zealand Herald's publisher and the owner of News Talk ZB. James Grennan now says he has the backing of enough of the other shareholders to make a move at the next shareholders meeting in about a month's time. And if he succeeds, Grennan has said he would be an active chairman, wanting a change of commercial direction and some editorial oversight as well. And the current board and the Journalists' Union and former Herald journalists and editors have all expressed fears that he wouldn't be just active, but an activist when it comes to the editorial direction at the Herald. Now that's prompted James Grennan to complain that people he's never met are painting him unfairly as some sort of extremist. Though, as far as Mediawatch knows, he's turned down every invitation to be interviewed and responded to every request with no or now is not the time. So far, all this has played out in a series of long letters and replies between Mr. Grennan to shareholders, the NZME board, some journalists and the Journalists' Union too, as Hayden Donnell explained on Midweek Mediawatch.
They ask him to publicly affirm that you will uphold editorial independence, that board members will not use their position to steer content, and that any structural changes that he makes will also preserve editorial independence. And Jim Grennan has now replied.
And in his reply, did he give those requested commitments to editorial independence?
No, not exactly. It's an interesting tactic that he answers a question with a lot of questions. So a set of questions. I'll summarise the questions. He says, who sets the direction journalists work under? Aren't there already limits set for them by either a person or a committee of people above them? Do journalists have complete autonomy now? They can't just write any old thing they like. They can't write factual inaccuracies or any scurrilous accusations. That's not editorial independence. Can't advertisers and government interests impact editorial independence? So it's all a very interesting set of questions.
It's an interesting tactic.
Hayden Donnell and Emile Donovan there on Midweek Mediawatch last Wednesday. And because NZME is publicly listed, many of these letters are first coming to light on the website of the Stock Exchange. In the latest one on Wednesday, Grennan bullishly told shareholders resistance is futile and that he had the numbers now to get his picks onto the board. But having come over all deadly Dalek, James Grennan also said shareholders he'd been talking to have now backpedalled somewhat and he now wants compromise and more consensus and a quick resolution, he says, suggesting that he will accommodate other directors as well as his own choices, including, maybe, the current NZME Chief Executive Michael Boggs, who James Grennan had previously claimed was being paid far too much. That and more on Midweek Mediawatch this week. If you missed it, catch up with it on the Mediawatch podcast page at rnz.co.nz, or you'll find it wherever you get your podcasts. Now, in last week's Midweek Mediawatch, I also looked at how that story was unfolding at that time, including the development that the Takeovers panel had confirmed that it would be checking whether coordination might have taken place between the shareholders, which should have been disclosed to the company and the NZX. There's been no further news on that, but at the same time, the Free Speech Union was putting out social media messages in support of the takeover. In its words, leading the fight to retake our institutions, it starts one board at a time. We're just getting started, mate, they said to one critic on X. And on Facebook, the Free Speech Union said this.
Last year, we contacted a series of wealthy supporters, encouraging them to step up and work to ensure a more functional fourth estate. NZME board members will now have to face the music for the role they've played in tilting the playing field on numerous important debates. And not a moment too soon.
And on Thursday this week, the Post's Andrea Vance reported that the Free Speech Union had confirmed that it did encourage Jim Grennan to invest in NZME. Currently, he holds just under a 10% stake. That followed the Free Speech Union's public criticism of NZME, as well as other publishers, Allied Press and Stuff, which publishes The Post, because they didn't run advertisements from lobby group Hobson's Pledge, anti-vaxxers Voices for Freedom and the conservative Christian advocates Family First. The Free Speech Union's Jonathan Ayling said that other shareholders were concerned that individuals with what The Post described in its story as otherwise legal but unorthodox views were not having their campaign ads accepted. The most notable case of that was the Herald publishing a wraparound front-page ad to return the seabed and foreshore to public ownership, but then declining to publish further ads after a backlash. The Advertising Standards Complaints Board later ruled that that ad actually breached the Advertising Standards Code. And in response, Michael Wood, the spokesperson for the Journalists Union E2, told The Post,
"It appears to be an orchestrated attempt by people with very strong views on a range of public policy issues to take control of one of New Zealand's largest media outlets."
He said that the Free Speech Union should also now come out in strong support of editorial independence and to convince Jim Grennan to make the same commitment. So plenty to play for then, and probably plenty more to play out in the coming month before the NZME shareholders meeting. If you were in any doubt that we live in a very different world these days with Trump in the White House for a second time, well, this week's Signalgate scandal should do the trick.
The White House has launched fresh attacks on the journalist who was inadvertently added to a group chat in which top US officials discussed plans to launch airstrikes on Yemen. The Atlantic magazine editor Jeffrey Goldberg initially refrained from publishing all the messages, but has now done so after being accused of lying. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt has this morning accused Mr Goldberg of being an anti-Trump hater and a sensationalist reporter.
That was the 8:30 RNZ News headlines last Thursday morning. Meanwhile, in the US, pro-Trump media mouthpieces like Jesse Waters on Fox News were playing down the affair.
Did you ever try to start a group text? You're adding people and you accidentally add the wrong person. All of a sudden, your Aunt Mary knows all your raunchy plans for the bachelor party.
Now, sending out details of an imminent US military attack on a non-secure media messaging platform is clearly not the same as tagging a relative into plans for a raunchy boys' party, and it all served to remind Emily Maitlis of the Newsagents podcast that Trump's defence secretary was also a Fox News presenter in the past.
Pete Hegseth, who would ever have foreseen that taking a former weekend Fox and Friends anchor and making him into Department for Defence Secretary could end up this way? I mean, what a surprise.
And this is what Pete Hegseth himself, about to board a plane, told US reporters who asked him just how this had happened.
You're talking about a deceitful and highly discredited so-called journalist who's made a profession of peddling hoaxes time and time again, to include the hoaxes of Russia, or the fine people on both sides hoax, or suckers and losers hoax. So this is the guy that peddles in garbage. This is what he does. I would love to comment on the Houthi campaign because of the skill and courage of our troops. I've monitored it very closely from the beginning.
Well, the quality of American troops is, of course, not in question. It's the suitability of the people who lead them. But he went on to insist that no war plans had been texted and nothing that was classified, to which Jeffrey Goldberg responded in his first TV interview, pretty categorically.
No, that's a lie. He was texting war plans. He was texting attack plans.
And on the Newsagents podcast, Emily Maitlis pointed out that the Atlantic magazine editor was in fact the only one in this farcical affair who'd actually responded responsibly.
The one person who is cautious with the information that he puts out is the actual investigative journalist.
Emily Maitlis's co-host on the Newsagents podcast, John Sopel, said that he'd been leaked secret military plans in the past himself, and he'd also faced similar ethical dilemmas about what to make public and when. And the former BBC Washington correspondent used language that he could not have used on the BBC to describe Signalgate like this.
Has there been a up like this one? I honestly find it difficult to think of anything that comes close in the scale of utter crass stupidity.
However, after all the outrage, no one has been made accountable for this stark security stuff-up. And that's something that disappointed Jeffrey Goldberg.
And the Secretary of Defense, all due respect, seems like a person who's unserious and is trying to deflect from the fact that he participated in a conversation on an unclassified commercial messaging app.
And there are receipts for it, which is always the danger of that. Jeffrey Goldberg, this reporting, you never know what you're going to wake up to in this day and age.
And though it's possibly not much of a consolation, Emily Maitlis on the Newsagents podcast said that Jeffrey Goldberg's article, "The Trump Administration Accidentally Texted Me Its War Plans," will now go down in journalistic history for this reason.
I mean, it is funny. Never has a journalist had to work less hard for a scoop of a lifetime than Jeffrey Goldberg, who didn't intend to be at the centre of this story. He didn't go looking for it. He just ended up on the chain.
But Jeffrey Goldberg has predictably also been called a loser and a sleazebag by President Trump himself, as well as a liar and scum by the US National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, who is the guy who appears to have handed Goldberg the biggest scoop of the year so far by adding him to that Signal chat group. Now, this is all very entertaining from afar and for the media, but it's also obviously serious and also an issue for us in New Zealand because we're one of the Five Eyes group. So can we now trust the US with sensitive information and the welfare of our own forces? That's a point Waikato University Professor Al Gillespie made to RNZ's Phil Pennington last Wednesday.
We've got a very small number of service personnel connected to the Red Sea, but they are present and they, like everyone else, is at risk if information is wrongfully shared.
And coincidentally, just the day before that, a task force led by the New Zealand Navy, Te Tawa Moana, made a major drug bust at sea off the coast of Oman, bringing the total of seizures to almost $500 million worth since they took over that force in January, according to the New Zealand Defence Force. Now, that didn't make many headlines here, but Navy Captain Dave Barr, the acting commander of that task force, put in a nod to his key partners from India when he quoted Mahatma Gandhi as saying, "You may never know what results come of your actions, but if you do nothing, there will be no results. So we'll keep trying," he said. That's New Zealand's commitment to collective security in the Middle East. Now, people in his vulnerable position would be hoping that those calling the shots in the US can now get their collective security together on digital security and off group chats on Signal, especially if there are going to be journalists in the loop. And finally, on Mediawatch this weekend, with far fewer journalists working in our regions these days, there can be a lack of local knowledge at times, which means mistakes can be made, which really annoy the people who live there. For example, the Herald last year reported on an incident in Pahiatua, which was described as a suburb of Palmerston North, when in fact it's its own town and it's more than 30 kilometres away. Not good. And when Catherine Ryan ran through what 9 to Noon listeners were going to hear on the show last Monday, well, she wasn't even sure her own script was right.
Edible bale netting. The Southland farmer trying to reduce plastic use in hay baling. Order requests are coming in from overseas, but what do the cows make of it? Actually, I think he might be from East Otago. Can you Google Gore? I'm pretty sure it's in East Otago, but we'll find out.
Well, 9 to Noon's producers did, and within 30 seconds, Catherine Ryan was able to set the record straight like this.
It is 7.5 minutes past 9. You are listening to 9 to Noon, and Gore is officially in Southland, according to my colleague. So that solves that problem.
All good. Now, to be precise, farmer Grant Lightfoot won an environmental award for his edible baling at Field Days in Waimumu, which is near Gore, And he then joined 9 to Noon to tell the tale from his deer farm at Orepuki, west of Invercargill, which is also in Southland for sure. But the interview started with a quick fact check from Gordon himself.
Going back a wee bit, you said there I found some plastic in one of my cows. I didn't. That was one of the ones I got from a vet. So, I don't.
Gotcha.
I don't leave any plastic lying around on my farm.
Gotcha.
All good, never wrong for long, as they say. But the morning after that, it was a case of the producer contradicting the host rather than correcting them on News Talk ZB. Now, on the Mike Hosking breakfast, the host gives his opinion fairly freely on most things, including sport. And in season, he talks an awful lot about the Warriors. And lately, he's also filled a lot of airtime with opinions about Formula One in general and struggling Kiwi rookie driver Liam Lawson in particular. But he told his listeners last Tuesday he wasn't impressed by football's All Whites qualifying for the FIFA World Cup on Monday, even though the men's team have only managed it against the odds twice before.
When it comes to the World Cup, because the World Cup's the biggest thing in the sport world, and the fact that we just get to turn up seems to put us into this fizz.
No fizzing from Mike Hosking, though, but in the Daily Highlights podcast of the show, his producer Glenn Hart added a little commentary of his own.
Yeah, Mike, strangely dismissive of the 25,000 people who turned up at Eden Park last night to watch the All Whites qualify. I pointed out that that's the same number of people that turn up for the Warriors, and that's not on a Monday night because they don't have Monday night games in NRL anymore. They used to, but why did they stop them? Oh yes, that's right, because nobody went. Anyway, facts, eh? So inconvenient.
Yes, facts are inconvenient sometimes, but at other times, when the producers have them at hand, they can correct the record quickly or even spare the host's blushes. That's all from Mediawatch for this week. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week looking back at more of the week's news and media. And if you have any thoughts to share with us or ideas for us to follow up in the meantime, get in touch. Email us, mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you'll also find us at MediawatchNZ on X. And you can even write us an old-fashioned letter and send it to Mediawatch, P.O. Box 123, Wellington. I'll be back next Wednesday with Midweek Media Watch. Catch you then. In the meantime, follow Media Watch and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.